So if we look at automation levels today in shared services and outsourcing, it's pretty much the same. We find in Hackett research, when we look at these things, that between 20 and 40% of a process is automated. Now you can measure that in different ways, obviously depending on the process. So sometimes we would take the volume of the process and look at how much volume is automated, how much is manual, and sometimes you dissect the process into small pieces and then you look at which activities are automated. So there's different ways to measure it, but ultimately you come up with about 20 to 40% automation level, which if you think about it is not too high, because we are talking about transactional processes and we are talking about processes where there's a lot of providers out there who are eager to sell you software and help you improve these things. So, and obviously it works because the 20 to 40% are automated, so you sort of wonder why it's not utilized across the organization. And it cannot be the business cases either, because the business cases typically are positive. So the only thing that you can come up with to explain this is that in some cases maybe the wage arbitrage option was just better to select. So basically companies have simply decided to lift and shift a process into a low-cost location, and because they got that benefit out of it, they did not focus so much on process reengineering and the automation. So it's basically the old process now running on a lower cost base. So there was just not pressure to do it. Since a lot of the globalization activity already has taken place, which means a lot of activity already has been offshored, the companies are now faced with the need to really look at the process reengineering piece, because the wage arbitrage option has gone to a large extent. Therefore, we do expect a lot more automation to be put into the processes in the near future, and it will actually lead to radical job losses in Western Europe and North America. So Hackett, for example, has a piece of research on this that estimates 1 million jobs in G&A will be lost in these Western economies until 2014. So G&A means IT, finance, HR, procurement. And that is quite radical. And most of that is actually because of automation. It's not necessarily because the jobs are moving. So there's quite a lot of automation still coming up, and the effects of that will be quite massive. And although we had a similar effect in the past 10 years, which was actually over 4 million people, we did not feel those jobs that much, because anybody who's done a feasibility and implemented shared services will know this. You could find a lot of other job opportunities for those people who in certain locations were not needed anymore, because those activities were actually transition to the shared service organization. But that's not going to be the case anymore in the future, because the remaining population is so small, there's not going to be anything else to be done on it. It's like you come from 20 locations maybe to 5, and now if you go from 5 to 1, there's just not going to be anything anymore you can offer them as an alternative. So the 1 million is going to be radical in terms of change management requirement, and it's going to produce a lot of noise, both in press, in workers' councils, in unions, in labor relations, in employee satisfaction. A lot of noise is going to be there. So the requirements for, say, the GBS organizations in the future are going to be much higher in terms of dealing with all this change management. In outsourcing cases, most of the outsourcing cases actually are such that the client outsources certain amounts of activity to the BPO, but requires the BPO to utilize the client's system landscape. So the BPO basically just utilizes whatever automation is there. Hence, automation level does not change radically in that situation, right? Because it's the same environment that's being utilized just by an external party. Now, they do have tools, they do have technology available that they can utilize to put on top of whatever they're doing. And in some cases they do that. So they do enhance the process and they do increase the automation levels by utilizing the technologies they have themselves. So in some cases BPO can be a good way to also increase technology utilization, but it comes down to the client's existing system landscape and the existing technology utilization in terms of their automation levels they have. That's the starting point. If the BPO then has something that they can put on top of that to increase it, that's great. So that's one option. The other option, of course, is that the client, which doesn't happen too often, but that the client actually gives the BPO access, more access than typically, to actually change the system environment. Maybe even buys new systems or new technology from the BPO or through the BPO. And in that case, of course, you can get to a much higher automation level, maybe even quicker. both of these options are good, but coming from 20 to 40%, that's still a massive journey that we have in front of us. And the funny thing about the automation levels is that if you look back 10 years, we used to, in the Western economies, have the argumentation that we can afford to have higher cost because we are going to compensate for the higher cost by having higher productivity. And it's the scheme on which this whole economy is based, and it works in general. The trouble is that in this space that we're looking at, this equation doesn't work anymore. For two reasons. A, because the low-cost geographies have caught up. They're just much better now. So for the cost that they cost, they are just much better. So it's sort of tilted that way. And the other thing is that the automation levels were not improved here because people utilize the wage arbitrage option more than the real re-engineering option. So the equations changed in that way that it's not as far as it should, and therefore we get into trouble in Western economies nowadays because this view doesn't work anymore. One argument always against offshoring would be that you offshore now to some low-cost location, but in those low-cost locations the wages are going to increase. They're going to increase much more radically or rapidly than in Western economies, high-cost economies. Now, to some extent, of course, that is true. We will see some wage increases, especially in certain locations for certain populations or certain types of skills. So say in one city somebody opens up a shared service center and requires a lot of SAP knowledge or specific accounting knowledge. That type of knowledge will become scarce, and of course the price for certain types of jobs or certain skills will rise, maybe even dramatically. I mean, we're seeing 30, 40, 50% rises per year in some of these categories. But there's a few things to remember. A, that will not happen every year, because then the market sort of takes care of itself. If there's suddenly such a demand and the price goes up 50%, people will come into that market. Those services will be, or those capabilities will be offered more, and the price will go down again. So in the long run, it's not going to be 30% every year. The other thing is that if you look at past performance and you extrapolate, then there is no example anywhere that would explain why the gap would really close. Because even if you have a, say, 5% increase or 10% increase on a very low base, it's actually going to be less in absolute terms than maybe 1.7% on a higher base. So the difference actually doesn't go away too much.